Salvatore Babones is an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He is an associate professor of sociology and social policy at the University of Sydney in Australia. His academic research focuses on social inequality and economic growth. He recently wrote the book 16 for 16, a progressive agenda for 2016. Welcome to the Soapbox, Salvatore.
Thank you for having me on the program.
All right, so as we were discussing just moments ago before we started recording, this is a relatively small book, but there's a lot of very important, significant issues in this book. So can you tell me just a brief overview of the inception of the idea to write this book and how it came about?
Sure. I'm an academic sociologist. My other books have titles like latent variables and factor analysis. I'm a quants guy with a Master of Science in Statistics. Looking at American social policy over the last 10 years has just been more and more depressing every year. And this book is the attempt of a social scientist to wade into these debates to say, my God, what is going on in my country? We really need a better course. And with the 2016 election looming and a wide open field, I think now's the time not to talk about candidates, but to talk about policies, to tell our candidates what we want from our next government.
Mm-hmm. Let me just quickly correct myself. The subtitle of the book is A Progressive Agenda for a Better America. 16.
And I think that's what we all want, is a better America.
Right. Okay, so can you just quickly explain the relationship between you and this book and Truthout.org?
I have written many short articles over the last 4 years for Truthout.org. Truthout is a fantastic progressive news website. I strongly encourage everyone to have a look at it. Truthout has really helped me improve my writing for a popular audience. It's helped me test out some of the ideas in the book. I really can't emphasize enough that I come from a science background. My academic writing is full of regression tables and quantitative methodology. It's not the sort of thing you would write for a popular audience. Mm-hmm. Truthout really helped me take my academic writing and transform it in a way that made it accessible for ordinary people and people who are concerned about the country.
Okay, and now you, in the book, well, first of all, before we move on from that, I would just like to point out that, you're not getting any royalties from this book. All of the profits are going to Truthout. Is that right?
Well, that's right. The author royalties are going directly to Truthout, not through my hands at all. And I think that's a very small way to say thank you for all of the work. Organizations like that, news organizations that are trying to bring investigative reporting to the people, are expensive to run and have very little funding. Mm-hmm. And if I can do a little bit to help, I'm absolutely thrilled. I have a salary. I work as a university professor. Book income is not what I rely on to pay my bills. Mm-hmm. When I do an interview for someone like you, I don't get paid. It's not what pays my bills. Mm-hmm. I think most people in these public debates are paid intellectuals for hire. And I really want to emphasize that university professors like me, people at organizations like Truthout, are really there to tell the truth, not there to make money.
And there's just a couple sort of biographical, personal elements about you that I'd like to just touch on before we get going so people can sort of contextualize where you're coming from. One interesting thing is that you are living in Australia primarily at this point. I assume you still hold American citizenship, but you're sort of an expat. So what brought you out there? Or were you fleeing from this broken down system, or was it something else?
Not exactly. I think, many people think that university professors are some kind of privileged class. And I can tell you at the University of Pittsburgh, where I used to work, employment conditions were very aggressive. I worked there for 5 years as a PhD educated professional with a full-time job. and yet I had no salary increase beyond inflation over that 5-year period. I went to my bosses and said, I'd like a raise. It's been 5 years. And they told me if I ever wanted a raise, I would have to go on the job market, get an offer to find out how much I'm worth and prove to them how much I'm worth. Now, for university professors, that's very difficult because, taking a job somewhere else means moving cities, moving states, or even moving countries. I mean, you don't just get a job offer across town in Pittsburgh, like if you were an accountant or a doctor. And I went on the job market. I got an offer from the University of Sydney. It was much better money, much better weather. And even though I loved Pittsburgh, I simply couldn't resist. And I packed up and moved to Sydney, Australia.
And so obviously you still have great affection and a sense of connection to America to be motivated to write this book. Do you expect...
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm American. I'm not Australian. I live in Australia, but I don't have Australian citizenship, and I have no intention to become an Australian citizen. In fact, I've just published an article yesterday with The National Interest, which is a major conservative policy magazine, about the future of American dominance in the world. America is what I care about. I may live somewhere else and enjoy it, but America is my country.
Well, and that's actually a nice segue into the one final thing before we get into some of the chapters in your book. You sort of out yourself as, or identify yourself as a conservative, and yet you've written this clearly very progressive agenda. And you write for Truthout, which you identify as a progressive news outlet.
Right.
What do these terms mean to you? Well, how do you define conservative, and why do you identify that way, even while writing about these progressive issues?
I think that the term conservative has been hijacked by the extreme right in America. Famously, in 1996, Barry Goldwater, the arch conservative of the 1960s, the most right-wing presidential candidate ever, in people's popular imagination. In 1996, Barry Goldwater complained to Bob Dole, who was then running for president, that he and Bob Dole were now considered liberal Republicans. And the irony of that is that Barry Goldwater and Bob Dole started the conservative revolution in the Republican Party. The fact is the Republican Party has become so right-wing that it's almost not recognizable as the party of Abraham Lincoln, or even the party of Dwight Eisenhower, or even, I could say, the party of Ronald Reagan. Today's Republican Party is so far to the right that you can be a conservative in America, and being a conservative puts you in the progressive Democratic camp. I mean, let me give some context. I mean, my father was a Teamster. My mother is a conservative Christian. I grew up in a Christian household. I've never participated in a student protest when I was in high school or college. I'm not out in the streets. I wasn't in Occupy Wall Street. My progressiveness is completely intellectual. I look at the facts as I see them as a scientist, and the facts really come down on the side of a progressive agenda for America.
Well, I wonder also, I mean, I think the right has been so incredibly successful. I mean, they played this long game, going back to the New Deal era, where they created think tanks to disseminate their perspective and begin to alter the opinions of the people. They
Exactly.
obliterated unions. They, through the McCarthy era, they completely, eviscerated the legitimate left wing in the country, the socialists, the communists, and the unions as a part of that as well. So I guess, is the political reality of America such, I mean, because it's not just Republicans that have moved right, obviously the Democrats have moved pretty far right as well. Is the political reality such that there is a place for this book, 16 for 16, a progressive agenda for a better America? Are there people hungry for the solutions and suggestions that you make in this book?
This book is not written for politicians. This book is written for people. I want to see people demand reasonable policies from their politicians. You're right that the political space has moved so far towards a ludicrous right-wing fantasy that most practical politicians today are very far to the right of the policies that I promote in this book. Surveys show, however, that the American people are not far to the right of the policies advocated in this book. And what I would like to do as a scientist is give ordinary people the tools they need to argue for the policies they want. When ordinary people want a high minimum wage, I want them to be able to turn to my chapter on a minimum wage, a living minimum wage, chapter 9, and use the references in that chapter, use the analyses in that chapter to show their politicians and to show their friends and to show everybody that a higher minimum wage won't lead to lower employment, a higher minimum wage won't lead to corporations all going out of business. A higher minimum wage will simply lead to higher wages. That's what the academic research shows, and I think people need to know that when they argue with their political leaders about what they want.
Mm-hmm. One last question before we get in, because the book is very accessible, as you say. It's very well sourced and well cited, and anyone can pick it up and check out. A lot of the sources are online, which is quite handy,
right.
and you include all of those in the book. And the way it's structured is great. It's 16 chapters, one chapter for each issue. And we're going to get into them in specifics, momentarily. But before we do, I just one more question.
Sure.
That disconnect that you were just identifying. I mean, it is clear, according to polls, that the populace of America is not overly conservative, as we understand the term now, and yet the policies of our country don't reflect the will of the people. Does this sort of point to a major problematic disconnect between the will of the people and ours, or I guess, does this point to a problem of democracy? Do we have a democracy still that would allow for the will of the people, when exerted in the proper fashion, to bring about some of these policy changes that you suggest?
This is a problem not just in America, but globally. Many democracies around the world don't reflect the will of the people, and so global opinion surveys show that people around the world feel like they don't have confidence in their own governments. And that's true in America, but it's also true in Australia, the UK, and in Western Europe. The problem is that politics everywhere has come to be dominated by money and special interests. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean we have to get rid of democracy. It means we have to fight harder for a better democracy. I mean, after the after the stock market crash of 1929, the Republican Hoover administration floundered for 3 years, doing nothing about the Depression until Franklin Roosevelt swept to power with the platform to address the problems of ordinary people. Mm-hmm. I think in the same way, we have been floundering since 2008 without addressing the problems of the Great Recession. I think that it's entirely possible that a candidate today could come forward with a progressive agenda and find the American people solidly behind her or him. Now, I'm not a political scientist. I can't tell you what it takes to win elections, but as a sociologist, I can tell you that these policies are popular and they're realistic.
All right, so let's get into the issues. Chapter 1, you open with, I think, what many in America would say is one of, if not the most important issue, the need to create jobs.
Jobs.
Right. And so the question is, the recession is officially over, according to economic measures, and the economy is growing again. Wall Street is booming. Why are people still feeling so financially downtrodden?
People are feeling downtrodden because there are no jobs. Employment has risen since 2008, but employment increases have not kept pace with increases in the working age population. In addition, most of those employment increases have been part-time jobs. As a result, we see people working 2 or 3 part-time jobs instead of having a full-time job. We see people working low-paid jobs instead of jobs with solid pay and benefits. And we simply don't have enough jobs, even including the part-time jobs, for people to work. As a result, labor force participation is down. A remarkable figure is that women's labor force participation in America maxed out in 1999. And since then, it has been going consistently down. That's unbelievable for 21st century emancipated society with gender equality, the fact that women are simply unable to find jobs. They're free to work these days if they can find a job.
And for less pay than men.
And for less pay and with no benefits.
So you say in the book, the economy has changed, I'm quoting now, and the private sector simply doesn't need another 9 or 10 million workers to get things done. If it did, it would hire them. It's ridiculous to blame job seekers for not looking hard enough. The jobs just aren't there, and it's increasingly looking like they're not going to be there. Can you explain, Salvatore, where you got this number of the 10 million jobs that we need? And then what do we do about the fact that the private sector just is not going to employ or is not going to create these jobs?
The 10 million job deficit was accurate as of the time of writing. Now it's more like 9 million jobs in deficit. That figure comes from extrapolating the percentage of the population who worked in the 2000s and assuming that the percentage of the population who worked in the 2000s would still prefer to be working now. That is, I assume that there wasn't a sudden shift in 2009 that people decided they no longer wanted to work. I assume that if people are not working, it's because the job options just aren't there. So if you extrapolate out the percentage of population who were working then to today, we find that there's something like 9 million jobs short of where we need to be for them all to be able to work. The official unemployment rate is under 6%, but the official unemployment rate only reflects people who are actively looking for work, not people who've given up and no longer bother looking for work. The solution is government. We need a change in the composition of the way work is done in America. And I mean, this is a very difficult theoretical argument, and in a way it's very simple and straightforward. If you look at the past 100 years, manufacturing has gotten more and more efficient. Wholesaling has gotten more and more efficient. The private sector in general has become more and more efficient, meaning they need fewer people to do the same work. As a result, we have shifted towards more and more consumption in the industries that depend on government funding: education, healthcare, social services, elder care. These are all things that are expanding. We need more of them. But they're things that people typically don't or can't pay for themselves. We can't expect elderly people living on Social Security to pay for adequate levels of elder care. We can't expect children and their struggling families to pay for more teachers in classrooms. The fact is that government has to be paying for these things. And government has paid for these things. If you look at the percentage of employees working for government, it's continually expanded from a very low number around 1900 to a very substantial number today. With today's attacks on government, however, this number has stagnated. Since 2008, we've actually seen a decline in the number of government employees instead of an increase. Well, cutting the number of government employees in the middle of a recession is madness.
Well, so you say $500 billion would be needed to create the 10 million jobs, maybe slightly less now for the 9 million. When you come up with that number, I think, some people would say, where is that money going to come from? And also my question is that money in this estimate on your part, would that be for permanent jobs, or would they be sort of temporary construction jobs? Would they be livable wage jobs as opposed to minimum wage, or even even if we raise the minimum wage, later on we can talk about your chapter on that. But would they include pensions and benefits? And if that number doesn't include those things, how much higher would that number go?
It's a back of the envelope calculation based on the overall costs of employment to the federal government today. So the entire mix of jobs of the sorts of people who are employed by federal and state governments, plus a multiplier effect that whenever you hire a government employee, money returns back into the local economy, and that government employee shops at a bakery or goes to the store or buys childcare services, and all of those things also create jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not a figure based on simply hiring 9 million people at a given wage level.
Mm-hmm.
It's a figure based on econometric analysis of how many jobs would be created by that amount of government spending. And it's in line with standard projections from the Congressional Budget Office and other economic institutes. It's not my own economics. The figure uses standard published approaches to multipliers and job creation, and simply puts the number together in one place. All the references are in the book chapter, but it's not controversial science. I mean, the controversy is, should we spend the money or shouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody agrees that if the federal government expanded its payrolls by $500 billion a year, that we would create an awful lot of jobs.
Right. And so in terms of the money, back to that again, you say, quote, instead of bailing out the banks to prevent an economic depression, we could have directly financed the creation of 10 million jobs to prevent an economic depression. It's far from obvious that we made the right choice. So, of course, we did bail the banks out. Do we have the money? Where did that money go? Obviously, you're suggesting, and I think most Americans would agree that was the wrong choice, was to bail out the government. Is that money out there? And should we generate that or put it on, the country's credit card?
The money is out there. There are two ways to get it. The two ways to get it are either to borrow, put it on the country's credit card, like you said, or to raise taxes. Personally, I'm in favor of raising taxes. I think we should reflect the costs of today's programs today, mm-hmm. But the country certainly has the resources to borrow when interest rates are at record lows. And I've had critics who tell me we should just borrow our way out of the problem. The Federal Reserve should just expand the money supply and use this. Federal government should use this money to pay for things. I have nothing against the people who want to borrow our way out. But like I said at the beginning, at heart, I'm really a conservative. Mm-hmm. I much prefer solutions that reflect today's costs today. And I would like to see a slightly higher tax on high incomes. I would like to see better enforcement of the corporate income tax. I would like to see a financial transactions tax. I would like to see Social Security tax applied to people's entire income, not just their first $110,000 of income. The money is there if we want to get it.
Yeah, okay, so let's jump to Chapter 5, which is raise taxes on top incomes. You say high inequality plus low taxes equals fiscal crisis. Can you explain?
Well, I don't even think it needs explaining. Low taxes mean that the government doesn't collect enough money. High inequality means the government has to spend money supporting poor people. Mm-hmm. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but every employee at a discount store like Walmart or a low-wage employer like Amazon, every employee at those companies costs the federal government money for food stamps, for subsidized school lunches, for health insurance under the new Obamacare program. Well, government's costs go up when there are lots of poor people, and government's receipts go down when we have low taxes. I would suggest entirely opposite. We should have policies that tax high incomes to bring in more revenue to government, and policies that promote higher incomes among poor people, which reduce their dependence on government. I'm not advocating in my book a massive increase in welfare payments to poor people. If you look through the book, you'll find very little mention of welfare. Mm-hmm. What poor people need is higher income. They don't want to depend on the government. Mm-hmm. They want to depend on themselves. But in order to do that, they need the chance to earn a decent wage.